Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the National Career Development Association, this is the NCDA webinar series. This session is titled The Unseen Impact, Addressing Trauma and Fostering Resilience in Career Development. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA Director of Professional Development, and I've got just a couple of reminders before we get started. During the webinar, please keep your microphones muted, and if you have questions, you can add those to the chat as we go. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording link will be posted on the NCDA website and YouTube channel, and I will email the link to all registered attendees, excuse me, after the session. This program is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So for NCDA members, this will be automatically added to your account, your record with NCDA after the session. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session. You've got a real rock star panel here. It's going to be led by NCDA Board Trustee for Counselor, Educators, and Researchers, Dr. Galaxina Wright.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Melissa. We really appreciate all your help with this webinar. If you are joining, that means that you are going to be here with us discussing the unseen impact of trauma, addressing trauma, and fostering resilience in career development. And I have our wonderful speakers for the panel with us today. So I'll go ahead and do just some brief introductions of them. Their full introductions, or bios rather, can be found on the registration link, as well as later I will provide their LinkedIn links as well too, if you'd like to connect with us outside of that. First introducing Dr. Lisa Cardello, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Online Counselor Education at the College of New Jersey. She has a small private practice, Career Clarity Counseling and Consulting. And Dr. Cardello's research interests include the interconnection between career and mental health, career development of graduate counseling students, mentorship, and trauma-informed care. And her most recent presentation at the NCDA conference was a collaboration with myself, Infusing Trauma-Informed Care in Career Counseling, Promising Practices, and a Framework. We also have Amanda Chinkin joining us as well too. Amanda has 20 years of experience in the field of career development, about half of that time as a career counselor. She is the founder and owner of Choice Career Counseling, LLC, and has appeared on several podcasts on topics such as career trauma, imposter gremlins, and a workplace mental health and well-being. She's currently transitioning as well into the role of trustee for private practice, business industry, and agencies for NCDA. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Deandra Prescott joining us as well too, who's an associate professor and program coordinator for the counselor education at University of Connecticut. Dr. Prescott's research centers on effective career development, interventions for STEM undergrads and underrepresented student populations in higher ed, and she's also completed research on the impact of trauma on career development. She's currently the president for the Connecticut Career Counseling and Development Association and will be transitioning into the role of president-elect for NCDA. I also wanted to share that Amanda Chinkin also presented at the NCDA conference with Ray Stout, who was unable to join us, but they presented on fostering resilience in clients using a trauma-informed approach. And Dr. Prescott presented with Dr. Latoya Toby, sorry, excuse me, on intentional implementation of trauma-informed career counseling supervision strategies. We're so glad to have you all here. And so we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. We understand just from research the impact that trauma has on career development. Research shows that trauma significantly affects career development, manifesting anxiety, decreased motivation, and difficulty in decision making. So the question I'd like to start off with for our speakers is, in your experience, how can trauma impact career development, and in what ways does it show up? Amanda, if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with you to kick us off.
Okay. So I think in my experience, and this is really kind of the group of people that I tend to serve are folks who are really like feeling stuck in decision making, like not sure if I stay, if I go, what should I do, whether that's in work and life and how work supports life. So that's how I see it show up most often. And that also comes along with anxiety, right? Because now I'm feeling anxious that like I can't make a decision. And so that's how I see it most often in clients that I serve.
I can jump into Galaxy and add a couple of thoughts. I definitely agree with everything Amanda shared. I think one of the most important things to recognize is that for survivors of trauma, they've had their sense of safety and sense of control stripped away. So whether that traumatic event, whatever that may be, happened a week ago, a month ago, 10 years ago, sometimes those feelings can remain and become pervasive. Um, Trauma survivors, from what I've noticed, is there's a lot of challenges around those two pieces, right? Sense of control, sense of safety, but also self-esteem, a lack of hope for the future. And where that becomes problematic with career development is those are all the same things that are really essential for navigating career pathways, career decisions, career challenges. So as a result, trauma can really delay or complicate career development process, right? Setting goals, making decisions and choices, just like Amanda said, and feeling confident in your own vocational identity. The only other piece I'll add here too is I think there's a hidden nature that comes into play where clients often don't show up in our session or office and lead with sharing the fact that they've experienced some type of trauma. Instead, it shows up as this: I'm stuck, I'm unmotivated, I'm having trouble getting along with folks at work. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not always trauma, right? It could be a misalignment of values and work. Like it could be a lot of different things. But I think being in tune with the fact that there could be something under the surface there, it could be a trauma related response, is important to keep in mind as we're working with folks who may have experienced some type of trauma.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. As you just said that, it reminded me of a current client that I had that is just now seeing the connections between her family system and kind of how she's interacting with her supervisor. So I definitely touched on that. Dr. Deandra, or Dr. Prescott, I apologize. You unmuted for a moment?
I did. Thanks, Galaxina. So I just wanted to share a bit about a study that I conducted with a colleague of mine. So in 2016, we had the unfortunate nightclub shooting in Orlando at Pulse, and when I was talking to a colleague about it, we thought we should do some type of study that looks at how trauma impacts career, because we were thinking, as we supported individuals during that time, what does it look like to go back to work? What does it look like to engage with others? How is this affecting the path moving forward? So we decided to write an article entitled "Career Adaptability of Trauma Survivors: The Moderating Role of Post-Traumatic Growth." And so what we did there was we examined college students who identify as trauma survivors and looked at how trauma symptoms and post-traumatic growth relate to career adaptability. So things like the ability to manage change, exploring options, make career decisions. And we found that higher trauma tends to be associated with less adaptability, and that for some people, growth following trauma helps bolster adaptability, and that people who report higher post-traumatic growth show less of a negative impact of trauma symptoms on their career adaptability. So in effect, the growth and trauma buffers or sort of reduces the harm. And we found that in the study that we did.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Prescott. And I know we're going to do questions at the end, but just kind of scanning through, some people have requested for you to share that research. So if you happen to have the link, but no rush or pressure with that. We're going to go ahead and go to the next question. A lot of the things that you talked about in each of your responses also just talked about some maybe typical events that have happened. We know that there's a lot of global crisis and social movements that have highlighted the urgency for trauma-informed practices and career development, and a need for greater awareness and support systems. So as you guys have already sort of touched on those somewhat, can you continue to expand on that? So, what events have occurred in recent years that have increased the need for to address trauma in the workforce? Dr. Cardello, if you don't mind starting us off, I know you had touched on that as well too.
Sure, yeah. And in answering this, I'll mention I know we're saving questions for the end too, but somebody brought up a good question of like what are we really referring to when we say trauma? And that's a great question. I pulled up the SAMHSA definition, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, because there are so many forms of trauma. And even in our comments so far, we've touched on different types, but it's not, we haven't touched on them all, right? So trauma can really refer to a single event, a series of events that involve or threaten serious injury, abuse, all different types of abuse, and have a lasting adverse impact on an individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So that's the SAMHSA definition. And again, we can think of how trauma shows up in a lot of different forms. The recent events piece, where to begin? That's my initial reaction to this question. Thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, the widespread grief, and all of the workplace disruptions and everything that came with COVID, the social and political unrest that has been going on and continues, that our clients are facing, racial violence, discrimination. There's a lot of ways that we're seeing this come up. Um, I think what I would add here is the fact that there's estimates out there in the research that talk about how many people have been impacted by some type of traumatic event in recent years. And the estimates I've seen are around in the neighborhood of 70%. And I can't help but think that that's underreported. But even if we go with the 70%, taking into account all of these events and things going on that are impacting our clients, the clients, the individuals, the students that are sitting in front of us in our offices, I think with those prevalence rates, it's more likely than not that folks have been impacted by some type of traumatic instance in recent years. So I think that really speaks to the importance of what we're talking about today, right? Being trauma informed in our approach to career counseling.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Cardello. And I'm sure a lot of people can empathize on the call today that there's just a lot going on, right? Unfortunately, it's, every time we log onto social media or turn on the news, there's something else that we know inevitably is going to impact people either within their workplace or those other areas of wellness that we know also inevitably impacts occupational wellness. Any other thoughts on this question before we move forward? And thank you for those adding in the chat as well too, just those other things that you're witnessing with your own clients, right? In regards to these different events that are going on and affecting them as well.
I guess I'll just jump in. So I'm in Baltimore, the DC area. So I think as Dr. Cardello was talking about, like more broadly, the things that have been going on for years and decades that have impacted clients. We are in the midst of it in this very moment with the decimation of the federal government, and then the local economies that are impacted around that. So it's happening like in this moment where people are experiencing a traumatic instance. And they may or may not call it a traumatic instance, but I think from our perspective, being really mindful and having a trauma-informed approach, regardless of what they might call it. Because the person gets to decide if it's traumatic for them. And often when something like this has happened immediately, we're surviving. And so we're maybe not able or ready to address certain things, but we can figure out how to get our needs met.
Absolutely. And thank you for that reminder too of just how the person determines that level of trauma and identifying that and how it's affecting them. And you both sort of touched on this as well too, but the other thing that the research has shown is that we know that trauma within our communities, unfortunately, does disproportionately affect marginalized communities. There are different barriers relating to career advancement, access to resources, and overall well-being that also impact our clients. So again, wondering from your all perspectives, how does trauma disproportionately affect certain communities? Dr. Cardella, if you want to get us started.
Sure. Yeah, there's no doubt. I think we know from the research, but also our own practice, what we're seeing with our clients, that trauma affects certain communities um, at higher rates than others. So one that comes to mind immediately is marginalized groups, communities who are facing systemic racism, sexism, ableism, poverty, have higher exposure rates to traumatic things, right? Again, we said trauma takes a lot of forms, and what's traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, but thinking about exposure to violence, discrimination. The other thing with these communities is there might be fewer resources for recovery, right? Less access to mental health care and things of that nature. So um, there's no doubt that these communities are impacted at higher rates. I'm thinking about generational trauma, historical trauma, right? Certain communities carry that intergenerational trauma that can shape and at times limit career aspiration. So I think that's important to mention. The one other there's lots of communities and there's lots of groups we can talk about here. The one I also want to make sure I highlight too are the clients or the students that we're working with who are in lower paid, higher risk jobs. So, you know, delivery care workers, healthcare aides, right? We can think of lots of different examples, but we also know from the research that some of these groups are more likely to experience trauma, specifically in the workplace, and again, may have less access to benefits, medical benefits, mental health support. So I think the other panelists may have additional examples. And I think, thinking about this question, trauma can show up in different ways among different communities, but there is no doubt that some communities are more impacted than others.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up too, Dr. Cardello, because you also touch on just in the fact that when we think about marginalized communities, that can mean a lot of different things in terms of identity. I think you touched a lot on socioeconomic status, and that's one that sometimes doesn't get as often recognized, but definitely can be impacting for different populations that are within those types of positions that you shared. And Dr. Prescott got disconnected. She just texted me that she's trying to log back in. So Amanda, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back to you for now.
I was hoping for her insight. Hopefully she gets in soon. Yeah, everything Dr. Cardello said, I think, from a systems perspective, the communities that are most impacted are marginalized communities, people of color, the Black community. So we know these communities are impacted, and we can see that when we look at organizations and like hiring and who's at the top and what kinds of things are available, and the access to being able to move up or to move laterally. And I think I saw in the comments somebody mentioned like interpersonal violence, experiencing homelessness, incarceration, like all of those folks, our system does not support those individuals as they're trying to navigate, leaving those situations as best they can. So yeah, I've always thought of it as a systems thing and how our system is set up to not help certain communities.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. And that's one thing as a counselor educator that I'm constantly trying to remind my students of as well too. The other thing is just being mindful that we don't want to assume that certain groups have specific barriers, right? So kind of going back to what you were saying, Amanda, but really making sure that we're understanding that each unique individual, although they might have a likelihood of barriers, we don't want to assume the experience of certain populations or individuals. But definitely it helps to know and be aware of the research and where we're seeing the disproportionate effects as well. I apologize. I'm hitting next and it keeps going back for some reason. I don't know what's going on. It's a Friday though. For those watching the recording, even my computer is like ready to tap out for the week. And so we're now going to transition into trauma-informed care. This is a term that we often see within a lot of other fields. And we're excited, all of us here, that it's starting to show more of a presence within career development and that we're starting to have the conversation more of kind of what this looks like. So for those that may not be aware, trauma-informed care means recognizing the impact of trauma on individuals and integrating this understanding into practices, really with trying to have the reassurance that we are creating a supportive environment that fosters resilience and growth, with the hopes of preventing re-traumatization and as best we can. So for our panelists, what does trauma-informed mean for you all? What does that look like for you on your roles? And how can career professionals be creative with incorporating it in their roles as well too?
Do you want me to start? Is Dr.
Sure.
Prescott back yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm checking the participants, and she's not yet. So
Okay.
yes, Amanda, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So trauma informed is care, is essentially how we operate. Whether you're in a school or like I'm in private practice. So for me, it's my paperwork and what am I having people answer or not? How am I presenting just in my conversation with them? Making, not direct, like if somebody indicates maybe they have some sort of trauma in their past, not explicitly saying, so tell me about that. Because they might not be ready. There could be a whole host of reasons why. And also we know that saying it again has the potential of the person then reliving that traumatic event or instance, and we don't want to re-traumatize folks. So I've had some people say, well, I think this is really important for you to know, but I don't want to say it. So I might suggest to them that they can like write it down for me, or like we can keep going, and when we start to bump up, we can shift and they can let me know what they need. you know so that's how I bring in, like, so trauma informed is really how I try to operate my my business, and it's being aware of like how somebody might present with anxiety, right? Like, and just kind of being careful and asking the kinds of questions so that I can maybe have a guess, but like they get to say when they're ready, if they're ever ready. I hope, like, does that give some sense? There's a website that I'll drop in the chat that I think is really useful because it really talks about trauma-informed care. Like anybody can be trauma-informed. Like just you don't need to be a counselor or a social worker. Like all of us can operate in a trauma-informed way. And so this website just has some good ideas of doing that.
Yes, thank you so much for doing that, Amanda. That would be great. And I love how you were talking about how anyone can be trauma informed. Because really, when we look at this, it's a lens in which we view our clients, and then as well as what you talked about, our approaches, right? So how are we approaching the client in a way where we're allowing them the empowerment to be able to talk about these things on their own timing when they're ready to talk about it? Lisa, I'll go ahead and pass it to you and then to Dr. Prescott.
Yeah, so many thoughts on this one. My mind immediately went to the you don't need to be a counselor, right? I think all of us on the panel have been part of these conversations in the past year or so, maybe longer, about how do you take the trauma-informed approaches that are out there and apply them to career. And that's the thing I think I hear the most of folks saying to me, but I'm not a trauma counselor. Like, this isn't, I don't feel trained to do this, or I don't feel this is my role. And that's such an important point. I'm glad it was brought up already about you don't need to be a licensed clinical mental health counselor to be trauma informed. Some of us have those dual roles as a career practitioner and a counselor. Some of us don't. It doesn't matter. The SAMHSA resources and the things that are out there talking about trauma informed care are for anyone working with people. And again, given those prevalence rates we talked about earlier, I think it's timely and it's needed because so many of the folks we're working with are impacted by this. So yeah, Amanda, I don't know if the link you're dropping is a SAMHSA link, but that was what I was going to plug there is they have some great resources, the 4 Rs, talking about how to recognizing trauma and avoiding the re-traumatization piece was added later. But I think that's another piece that comes up. People who are well-meaning, wanting to help, asking questions that may push past that threshold of comfort for our clients or our students, exactly like Amanda was saying. So taking their lead and really being in tune with those types of things. The second part of the question too, about how can we as career professionals be creative with incorporating it in our role. When I think about a trauma-informed approach to career counseling, the number one thing that comes up for me is hope. Trauma survivors often have a diminished sense of hope. And there's a lot of research out there that says, even outside of career, when you're working with survivors of some type of trauma, hope is kind of that central factor that makes the difference of improvement of positive outcomes. The good news is, as career practitioners, we're in the business of hope. Like, this is what we do. Our work is future oriented. We often use a strengths-based approach when we're working with clients or students. Creating a sense of hope is already embedded in what we do. At least I think so. So finding ways to keep that hope central in the work that we do. I'll give one quick example. I've found that client stories of perseverance and strength can give really great insight into growth and recovery, right? So saying something along the lines of, it sounds like you faced some really challenging things in the past, and yet you found ways to move forward and keep going. That shows incredible perseverance. So let's talk about that. Can we explore those strengths and how those strengths might show up in your career and be able to help you move past challenges that come up in the future? So I think going back to trauma informed, honoring our clients' experiences, pointing out strengths and resilience. That's what Dr. Prescott was saying. I think her research spoke to before is looking at the other side of it, of the resilience and strength that can come from these types of things, and using a future focused approach to really help clients figure out how to leverage those strengths in the career development realm.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa, for what you shared, especially in regards to, like you said, some of the strategies you use in trying to provide that hope and resilience to clients. Dr. Prescott, did you want to share anything related to this question?
Sure. I missed so much. Excuse me, my internet was just being a little bit rude. But I'm glad to be back. Yeah, so I think the first step when we think about this piece is the listening, and that sort of came up before, but listening to experiences, listening to the stories of others when we're thinking about how we would like to approach, just so that first step. Um, right now, we seem to be living at a time where work is really not experienced as or felt as a safe space for a lot of people. And so when we hear things like being back in person, more face to face, while some people love that idea and really enjoy it, there's others who are not looking forward to that because work isn't a safe space. And so when you are able to create that distance from working at home, it's increasing satisfaction and those kind of things for people. So listening to those stories a lot more, I think, could help us all with empathy and with understanding the narratives that come out. So whether it's people of color or immigrants or the LGBTQ plus population. I don't know if you talked about this before. People with disabilities, low income, women, justice involved individuals. So such unique experiences. Just thinking about the many examples that I have or that I've experienced, being in spaces where trying to have a conversation about equity-minded teaching, and it results in this huge argument where faculty of color are being attacked because they want to talk about equity-minded teaching and what that looks like. Or having a friend of mine who's talking to me and she's saying, gosh, my colleagues were laughing a little bit today when we were having a conversation because they asked some type of question and included a reference to Harry Potter. And I've never seen Harry Potter. They assumed that everyone has, but we all have not. And so it kind of results in that a lack of that sense of belongingness and everything. And so I think when we are talking about trauma-informed approach, thinking about moving and working towards a trauma-informed workplace. So what does safety look like? Psychologically, physically, trustworthiness, communication, and boundaries, and being able to have conversations around that as a group. Implementing things like peer support. That is still something that is effective after one's schooling. Collaboration, feeling empowered. I heard that come up before. And learning more, again, about our unique experiences. So that idea of cultural humility. And so that's what I think about, where we could be creative with helping others at least start those conversations and how we can implement these things in the workplace.
Absolutely. And you touched on a lot of topics that we were talking about previously too, Dr. Prescott. One takeaway for sure is, like you were saying, the assumption that people want to be back in person and back to face. And I'm always surprised by that period of the Great Resignation, right? Once COVID had kind of settled a bit and people, we had a vaccination and people were going outside more. We assumed that people wanted to go back to work. But we actually saw the opposite, where they were like leaving in droves, right? Kind of touching back on that, disproportionate effects of people didn't want to go back in the office to experience racism or to experience microaggressions or to experience feelings of not being feeling belonging. And so you definitely touched on a number of those portions as well. Just keeps going back to the previous slide. All right. And then looking at a holistic approach, we talked about this and several of you touched on the SAMHSA model and looking at just wellness. And we know that occupational wellness touches on a lot of different other areas. We also know that a holistic approach recognizes the interconnectedness between mental, emotional, and physical aspects of trauma. And so how important is it as career professionals to carry a holistic approach when addressing trauma with clients? Dr. Prescott, do you mind getting us started with this one?
Sure. So thinking about a holistic approach, gosh, one, keeping in mind what we sort of talked about before was that most of us, what we actually can assume is that most of us have experienced some type of trauma in our lifetime, right? So whether that's at work or outside of work, 80% of people, even just who seek counseling, have experienced some sort of trauma. So keeping that in mind, I think asking about someone's experience, and I know I sort of spoke to that before, but knowing what else is happening with someone, the other roles that they play in any given week, experiences that they've had, choices that they've made, what sort of led them to the questions they have, or the career they're in, or the place they're at in their journey. I wrote with a colleague about looking at like an ecological approach. and looking at all the sort of various systems that are at play around us. So whether it's our immediate family or our community, um, our friends, what we're seeing in the news, something like COVID or other things that are significantly impacting our career journey. And just so learning about those other pieces, it's really hard to approach something in a narrow way, especially when it comes to career, because there's so many other factors that are included there. So I think keeping that in mind is really important. Narrative narrative therapy, when I even think about that, there's certain pieces of a narrative approach that can be very helpful because it focuses on telling one story. And so it's really connected to Mark Civicus's um, career construction interview. It's similar in many ways, but these types of approaches can allow us to learn more about who's sitting in front of us. Someone mentioned, yeah, motivational interviewing, such a wonderful approach that I think we all can use to learn more, to have more empathy, to gain more understanding, to be able to set goals more. I used that approach when creating like a career bullying and career disparagement course. So I think learning more. I can't answer any questions about my career without talking about my family, without talking about my upbringing in some way or what my life looks like in many other ways. And so I think it's just important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. I agree with everything that was said. I think career is inseparable from the rest of our lives. Um, we've all heard people say from time to time, like something along the lines of leave your personal business at the door when you show up to work. One of my students said one time, you have to leave your drama and trauma at the door when you show up to work. And that stuck with me because it's so easy to say. It is so difficult to do because we're human, we're people. I would argue it's impossible to do, to kind of separate ourselves and our identities in that way. When I think about a holistic approach to career counseling, I think there's been some great suggestions. I agree with motivational interviewing. I thought of it like even more like maybe on a very basic level of just being person centered. Our work as career practitioners goes, right? I'm not saying anything I think we all don't know. Like our work goes far beyond resume reviews and interview coaching. We're working with people, we're getting to know their needs, their fears in a lot of cases, their support systems, their coping strategies. We're getting to know them as humans. So I think that the holistic approach is so important, recognizing, like we've said, you can't separate those identities as sort of the person and the worker. They're so intertwined. I think keeping that in mind and remembering that career issues don't present in isolation um, are just important considerations overall, but especially when taking a trauma-informed approach.
Absolutely. As you guys were kind of speaking, I was thinking about a former client that I had, and someone actually had put in the chat about how anxiety can show up and how that relates to trauma. And a client that I had wasn't moving forward with interviews that she was being presented with. At first, I was like, okay, maybe this is some sort of resistance. But then come to find out, knowing the jobs that she was applying for, they were in cubicles. And she was saying that she didn't like the aspect that someone could come up from behind without her knowing, as that related to her past trauma. And I know you guys both spoke about that, about how it's almost impossible, right, to disconnect ourselves and who we identify as from our work, right? And oftentimes, depending on the person, like you said, motivational interviewing is a great aspect. I love that somebody put that in the chat because that's a big motivation of why we do what we do as well too. Amanda, I also wanted to leave space for you if you wanted to add anything.
Um, you all have said it beautifully. I think, I guess if we want like a really practical, like, I guess that's where I come in a little bit. in terms of like working directly with clients. Holistic is so crucial, like as everyone has beautifully said. And from like a practical standpoint, narrative approach, I mean, that's where I super lean into. And then being able to have resources. So I get the luxury being in private practice of being able to like know therapists in my community or like talk to people about where their social connections are, being able to like put some support them in how they might be building other parts of their life in order to support their career development. So, is it connecting with like a therapist? I'm talking often, especially right now, about where your social connections are, like who are your social connections, and encouraging increasing that often, because lots of us tend to start to isolate when we're feeling overwhelmed. So from like a resources, like holistic approach and being able to like know your resources, like as a practitioner, our scope of work is one thing, and then being able to support in other ways as people either share their trauma, or we kind of guess and we say, hey, have you ever thought about like this as a suggestion, if that's something that you do in your work. So those are my last 2 cents to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Amanda. And I think you highlighted too the importance of resources as well too. And kind of identifying those things that can help you the specific needs of your client as well too. And just being cognizant of time, we did want to give some opportunities for questions. I do see some in the chat that I'm going to go back to. I think we answered a few of them throughout. But if there are any questions, please feel free to either put in the chat or unmute. While you guys are thinking, there was one question in the chat I don't believe we've answered yet. And someone was asking if there were any assessments that you utilize to assess for trauma. So if there's any that you had to recommend.
I don't have I think you all might have more formal assessment tools. I use the career construction interview, and often in the stories part, they might not directly say it, but sometimes there's a memory that might clue me into something that might have happened. So that's just one part that I might use.
Yeah, and it looks like Mia is the same way. I saw her put in the chat that she also utilized that tool as well too. Lisa, did you have something?
I was going to echo the CCI, and there was actually a great article. I wish I could remember the authors now, but it was summer, probably June of last year, 2024. There was an article in CDQ, Career Development Quarterly, that talked about trauma-informed use of the CCI and how you could be mindful and trauma-informed as you go through that interview. So that was a great article. Again, I'll have to look it up as we're talking so I can give credit where credit's due. So definitely the CCI. I mean, I think for folks who are also licensed counselors doing career work, the brief trauma questionnaire is one that often comes up. But I think I also use a narrative approach. I think whether through a formal assessment or just through conversation, hearing about the client's stories, like Amanda said, those pieces start to come forward. I think it's important also to say, just in terms of assessment and what we're talking about, from what I see with clients, they don't always disclose this in the beginning. They don't always disclose it session one, even if you're doing a formal assessment. It's not until you build some of that rapport and trust that those things start to emerge. So I don't even know that it's a one-time assessment up front. Like I think those pieces are important, but being in tune and listening for those things throughout the time you're working with a client or a student or an individual, whether you're meeting for 2 sessions or 20, I think always having that lens is important. Yeah, and thank you to Erin who dropped that article in the chat. That's exactly the one I was thinking about, trauma-informed use of the career construction interview. So yeah, I think it was around summer of last year. If you're interested in that or using the CCI and want to give that article a read, it was a really good one.
Yeah, and thanks for touching on that and those resources that you guys provided. I was thinking about that as well too, of even going back to what you all said, of sometimes clients not knowing or thinking that their past trauma has any effect on their career, right? Like if they're coming it to you and just like, I want to focus on my career, I want to focus on, you know, this thing that brings me to you, they might not be connecting those pieces always as well. And I am getting through the chat, so definitely thank you for your patience. I see Carolyn Jones has a question for us in regards to resilience. To what extent possible is it important to assess a client's level of resilience? That's a good question.
Right, I think when we look at resilience, especially when we believe in strength-based approaches, looking at resilience is sort of it's a very important, sort of crucial piece in the work that we're doing, because I think when we hear trauma, sometimes we make certain assumptions about what a person has experienced or what they may have gone through or what life looks like now. And so when you're able to have an idea of what that resilience looks like or the growth, right? So we look at resilience and then there's the post-traumatic growth, which is sort of like a half step beyond the resilience piece. Um, it helps us to learn more about the person that we're working with, and it can help us change our approach a bit when we know where they're at as far as where um, their resilience lies. Again, for so many people, it's however they have coped with the trauma, they've been able to grow from it and even get to sort of a new playing field. That's important to really honor and respect. So um, I think it's extremely important because it again gives us an idea of where the person is at and how we should be approaching the conversation.
Absolutely. And that definitely seems like that also is why it goes hand in hand with trauma-informed approach of making sure that we focus on that level of resilience as well too, and keeping in mind with that. Another question that we have is, does the panel refer clients, or what are your boundaries when working with clients as career counselors? And I think this is a great question because we did talk about the trauma-informed approach and how everyone can incorporate this. But at what point would you refer out for a client?
I can start, or Dr. Cardella. Lisa, do you want to go? Okay. So it definitely depends on your like training and experience and your scope. So it depend on like your workplace. Like, so again, I'm in private practice. I'm also a licensed counselor, so my scope is pretty broad. And it's still there's still boundaries around it. Like for example, I don't work with folks who are in crisis. Um, I, and maybe some other have more maybe significant things that they're working through, like mental health concerns. That being said, like I work with a lot of clients who have a mental health counselor and they're coming to me for a career. And so we're very clear about what the work with me looks like and what the work with their therapist looks like. And there's overlap because feelings know no boundaries, right? But we can talk about that. And there are times where I'm like, oh, it sounds like we just hit on something and I'm not your counselor, so I'm gonna suggest that you talk to them about that next time you meet. And we can kind of come back and revisit. afterwards, or they sign a release and I talk to their counselor. So I think it's knowing your experience and your training and your scope. Like, for example, if you work in a university career center or you work for a career one stop, right? Like you have a very your scope is outlined very clearly. And so staying with that and knowing when it, if somebody says something or presents with something, that you've got your list of folks to, refer them to.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing that. Another question we have from Dr. Linda Woodard, what can workforce career center frontline workers do to balance self-care and empathy when dealing with job seekers who come to them for services?
Yeah, they're coming with all the same issues that our job seekers are coming. So that's a major challenge for them. Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, Dr. Woodard, and for your question.
I guess I'm looking at what kind of tools that can they practice each day, as I've worked with them as well, some ideas that they can practice daily.
Yeah, I know one thing that is kind of coming to my mind, and again, I will say, and Amanda said this beautifully too, of just sort of understanding, depending on where you're working, your role, right? And kind of at what point should you maybe refer out. But I know I'm working with foster youth who often deal with lots of trauma that they are coming from. One of the things that we have worked on in working with those youth that are job searching is also just identifying triggers, and when some things are going to bother them within the workforce or the workplace. And even if they can't address it then, to maybe put a pin in it, and how do we unpin that later, and really kind of unravel that a little bit more. Also, we do definitely emphasize self-care as much as possible, right? Because I think the other thing is a lot of frontline workers put in a lot of hours, and depending on the jobs that we were talking about earlier, between that and then maybe family obligations and other things and caretaking responsibilities, self-care can be hard. And so sometimes you do have to give sort of the gentle reminder, about self-care as well too, because that kind of gets lost for sure. I don't know if, oh, Dr. Prescott, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I think it's also the discussion about self-care that sometimes we think it's about needing an entire day or an entire weekend or spending a lot of money for self-care, and it's not. And so also spreading the message of self-care can be, 5 minutes in between meetings, or it can be um, listening to your favorite podcast or music station on the way to work. It can be in smaller doses that can still have a significant effect. So even if it's not, oh, taking the entire weekend and going away somewhere or something big, it can be things that we can do that don't cost anything, that can truly help us get through the day and get through another hour of the day. And so, yeah, thinking about that too, those smaller chunks of time that we can take for ourselves.
Thanks so much.
I'll just add one more thing, because I talk about this a lot with folks, is understanding your own energy and being mindful about your own boundaries and what you can give attention to and what you can't give attention to, and maybe maybe that needs to be set aside and come back to. But being in tune with your own self and needs, and right, like knowing I can't take a break right now, but I'll take a break in like 20 minutes. um you know this person really, like, I find like this is a really draining topic for me to talk about, so how do I manage my energy so that I can get through this and be able to come back and work on it? So I also think of like boundaries and essentially energy management, managing my energy, as also self-care, so that I can like get through what I need to get through and not be totally drained.
Absolutely. Thank you all for those responses. I know we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to continue to answer questions for those that might be able to continue staying with us. I am also getting ready to paste in the chat our LinkedIn profile. So if you want to continue to connect with us outside of this, please feel free to. I also have our contact information as well too. I'll go ahead and insert that in the chat. And we have another question from Aaron Haywood, which I'm like, Aaron, why didn't you ask this earlier? This is a good question. But how might intergenerational trauma shape the career decisions of first-generation young professionals who hold collectivistic values? For example, some may feel pressure to pay it forward or align their career paths with the sacrifices and pain experienced by older generations. Oh man, it's a lot in there, but that's definitely a great question. Any takers on tackling that question?
I mean, we could spend the afternoon talking about that, right? I mean, yeah, and I think it's something so many of us experience. I mean, gosh, I thought about my own family when I read that question just now, with how you want to make people proud, and even make others proud or make your family proud can mean so many different things to us. I know whatever I'm doing, one thing I remind myself, I guess I'll talk to that, is that even just the process of getting through what I got through as far as school and all of those things, even that right there, when I'm proud of that, and I know that also makes my family proud. So before everything, that comes after that, just even getting accepted into Rutgers for undergrad, something that my grandmother never even thought about, you know what I mean? And so I think, again, we could talk about that all afternoon, but those are just some reminders that I give myself. And I think having certain discussions with family also helps, because I've learned so much about their thought process behind that, and that sometimes I was putting too much pressure on myself in certain areas. Um, and if I could just get to one other question really fast, just because I know time, someone asked about justice involved students and trying to write a professional email and things. Just a couple things I would say is not over apologizing, and then like extremely personal language as far as what you're including in that email. But I just read it, so I just wanted to add something about that really quickly.
No, thank you so much for answering that, Dr. Prescott. Absolutely. All right. And I believe we have time for one more question. I'm looking through to see which ones we've already answered as well too. Or maybe we did get to all of them. Yeah, I think we actually did. So thank you to you all for asking these great questions to help navigate this conversation and this important work. Thank you to all of you as well that are doing this important work with clients and are being able to manage those conversations and those stories and those narratives while still helping them move forward with their career goals. Want to give a round of applause. I wish I could be louder, but to our panelists, really appreciate all of them and just being here and providing their expertise and experiences here. Again, our contact information is here as well as in the chat. I put in our LinkedIn profiles, as well as a small plug to the FCDA virtual summit as the past president. That's my little plug there. But definitely continue to look at the NCDA website for future webinars as well too. And we hope that you all have a great and safe weekend.